In the summer of 1990, two sisters set out on a short walk home. It was a path they knew by heart, one they had taken countless times before. The streets were familiar, the faces in the neighborhood just as familiar. In a town where everyone knew everyone, no one imagined danger could be lurking so close. But that night was different. The sisters never made it back. First, it was only worry. Their mother stood by the window, keeping the porch light on, waiting for the sound of footsteps, the sight of two figures coming around the corner. Minutes turned to hours, and hours into an unbearable silence. Neighbors gathered, whispering. The phone rang again and again, but there were no answers. What had started as an ordinary evening was now unfolding into every parent's worst nightmare. The girls were gone. No explanation. No sign of where they had gone or what had happened to them. One moment they were there, laughing, walking side by side. The next, it was as if the night had swallowed them whole. For the family, time stood still. But for the world outside, time marched on. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and then years. And all the while, the ground beneath their town held onto a terrible secret. For 11 long years, nothing surfaced. No clues, no remains, just silence, until a storm came, violent, relentless, and ripped the earth open. And in the aftermath of that storm, the truth, long buried, finally began to surface. In 1990, life in their small town felt safe, almost untouched by the kind of crime you'd hear about in the cities. Families left doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes until dusk, and the biggest worry parents had was whether their children would track mud into the house. For the Wright sisters, it was a world built on routine and trust. The older sister, insert name placeholder, e.g., Sarah Wright, was 15, thoughtful, responsible, the kind of girl who teachers said had a steady head on her shoulders. She loved drawing, and her notebooks were filled with sketches of flowers and animals. She often spoke of wanting to be an art teacher one day. Her younger sister, insert name placeholder, e.g., Emily Wright, was 12, bright, curious, with the kind of energy that never seemed to run out. She had a mischievous streak, the sort that made her friends laugh and her parents shake their heads, but it came from a good heart. Together, the two were inseparable. Neighbors often remarked that if you saw one of them, you'd see the other right beside her. They walked to school together, shared secrets no one else was allowed to hear, and even when they bickered, it never lasted long. That summer, their routine was simple. Spend the day with friends, help their mother with small chores, and be home before dark. Nothing unusual, nothing risky. And on that particular evening, when they said their goodbyes and started the short walk home, it should have been like any other night. But hindsight is cruel, because later, when investigators retraced their steps, they realized how many things could have gone wrong in those few short blocks. The road they walked was quiet, with patches of shadow where the streetlights didn't quite reach. There were houses, yes, but also stretches of open space, places where someone could wait unseen. At the time, though, no one thought about danger. The sisters were well-liked, respected, and watched over by a community that assumed bad things didn't happen here. Their father had once said, "If there's one place my girls are safe, it's walking home in this town." That belief was shattered the moment they failed to return. When their mother realized how late it had become, she called neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen them. But nobody had. Not a single person remembered spotting the girls after they set off. No familiar footsteps, no voices. It was as if they'd vanished the second they rounded the corner. And so began the panic. Flashlights cut through the night as neighbors combed the streets. Parents called their children back home, locking doors that had rarely ever been locked before. Police were contacted, though in those early hours they hesitated. Two young girls, close in age. The first thought was that maybe they had run off. Maybe it was rebellion, a teenage whim. But those who knew the sisters best rejected that idea outright. Running away wasn't who they were. These were girls who argued over what TV show to watch, who still held hands when crossing busy streets, who were planning sleepovers and summer projects. They didn't vanish by choice. And while the family pleaded for urgency, the clock kept ticking. The longer the night stretched on, the less likely it seemed the sisters would simply walk back through the door. By dawn, the town had changed forever. The evening of July 16, 1990, seemed unremarkable. The sisters left a friend's house just before 8 p.m., laughing as they waved goodbye. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, but there was still a faint glow in the sky, that soft summer light that lingers, giving a sense of safety. Their walk was short, only a few blocks, past familiar porches, across a quiet stretch of road, and then home. Simple, ordinary, but this time, the walk never ended. Neighbors later recalled hearing the sound of two young voices, fading down the street. After that, silence. No screams, no struggle, just silence. Their mother noticed the time first. At 8:30, she began to worry. By 9 o'clock, she was pacing. At 9:30, she stepped outside, calling their names into the night. No answer. The clock hands moved. The porch light glowed, but the corner stayed empty. By 10 o'clock, panic had spread. Calls went out to friends, relatives, neighbors. Nobody had seen them. Nobody knew where they had gone. The police arrived just after midnight, but instead of urgency, there was hesitation. Two young girls, close in age, missing at night. The first theory was simple: they had run away. Maybe they were hiding out at a friend's house, angry over a family argument, or caught up in some teenage rebellion. But those who knew the sisters rejected it immediately. These weren't girls planning an escape. They had no money, no extra clothes, no motive. They were happy, they were safe, and above all, they were inseparable from their family. Running away was impossible. Still, the hours ticked by. The search began, but slowly. Officers checked nearby houses, spoke to friends, walked the same paths the sisters had walked. Flashlights cut across empty fields. Dogs barked at nothing. And then came the questions. Did anyone see a car lingering by the road? Did anyone notice strangers in town? Was there someone waiting in the shadows? No answers came. By dawn, the search had widened. Volunteers combing ditches, deputies checking rivers, neighbors knocking on doors. The town, once defined by its quiet safety, was suddenly gripped with fear. But here's what gnawed at everyone. How could two sisters vanish in a matter of minutes, on a walk so ordinary, in a place so familiar, without a single trace? The questions only multiplied as the investigation unfolded. And soon, every lead, every rumor, every whispered suspicion would lead to nothing. The trail was about to grow cold. The official search for the sisters began at sunrise. By then, the whole town knew. Flyers with their photos appeared on telephone poles. Volunteers formed search lines across fields and wooded areas. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning from above. But despite the urgency, no real trace was found. No clothing, no personal belongings, not even a footprint. Detectives began with the obvious questions. Who had seen them last? Who lived along the road they took home? Was there anyone with a reason to hurt them? Neighbors were questioned. Friends were interviewed. Even distant relatives were contacted. But answers slipped through their fingers like sand. At one point, a farmer claimed he saw a car pulled over by the roadside that night. Headlights off, engine idling. It was the kind of detail investigators latch onto. Was it the girl's abductor? A local? A stranger passing through? For days, police chased that lead, but it ended in nothing. No car was identified. No driver was found. Just another dead end. Then came the rumors. Some whispered the sisters had been seen in a neighboring town. Others insisted they were hiding out with friends, waiting to be discovered. There were even anonymous calls claiming the girls had been taken far from home. Each rumor was investigated. Each led nowhere. The hardest blow came when a man, already serving time for violent crimes, confessed to killing them. For a moment, it seemed the case might finally have an answer. But when detectives pressed for details, his story unraveled. He had lied. Another cruel dead end. Meanwhile, the family lived in torment. Their mother refused to take down the porch light, insisting it would guide her daughter's home. Their father pressed the police for updates, but the updates never brought answers. And the community, once tightly knit, grew uneasy. Parents who once let their children roam freely now kept them close. Doors were locked, windows shut. A shadow of fear had settled over the town. Weeks became months. Months became years. The case file grew thicker, but the trail had gone cold. Every new tip ended the same way, nowhere. By the end of the decade, the sisters' disappearance had become one of the town's most haunting mysteries. Their faces, once on every poster and in every newspaper, began to fade from memory. But the truth was still there, buried, silent, hidden just beneath the surface. And it would take a storm more than a decade later to finally force that truth into the light. By the year 2001, the case of the missing sisters had become a ghost story in the town. People still whispered about it, at grocery stores, in church pews, at late-night diners, but fewer believed it would ever be solved. Their mother still left the porch light on, every night, for 11 years. But most neighbors no longer asked why. Everyone knew. And then, the storm came. It started as heavy rain. The kind of downpour that pounds on rooftops and rattles window panes. By nightfall, the rain had swelled into something far more violent. Winds howled, trees cracked, rivers spilled over their banks. For 2 days, the town was battered relentlessly. When it finally ended, the landscape had changed. Creeks had carved new paths through the earth, hillsides had eroded, and what was once hidden underground was no longer. It was a farmer, out checking the damage to his land, who saw it first. At the edge of a washed-out ravine, something pale jutted from the mud. At first, he thought it was a branch, but as he stepped closer, unease twisted in his stomach. It wasn't a branch. Police were called. Yellow tape went up. Detectives, long resigned to silence, now stood ankle-deep in mud, staring at what the storm had uncovered. Bones, clothing fragments, evidence that the earth had guarded for more than a decade. Within hours, forensic teams confirmed the unthinkable. The remains belonged to the sisters who had vanished on that warm July night in 1990. For 11 years, their fate had been buried in the soil. Now, by chance, by force of nature, the secret was exposed. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who had put them there? Why that spot? And, most importantly, could their killer still be out there? The storm had opened the ground, but it had also reopened the case. The storm had done what 11 years of searching could not. Peeled back the earth and revealed a secret that someone had buried long ago. When forensic teams arrived, they worked carefully, inch by inch, to recover what the floodwaters had exposed. Mud clung to everything, but even through the soil, the fragments were undeniable. Pieces of clothing, small personal items, and bones that told a story no one wanted to believe. The remains were fragile, but the evidence was clear enough. 2 sets, 2 sisters, side by side. The items found with them matched what they had been wearing on the night they disappeared. A faded piece of fabric, a broken necklace, details that parents never forget. For investigators, it was confirmation. For the family, it was devastation. After 11 years of living with questions, there was finally an answer, but not the one they had prayed for. The hope that maybe, somehow, the sisters had survived was extinguished in a single moment. Their mother, who had left the porch light on every night since 1990, wept when the news reached her. Neighbors said the sound of her cries could be heard down the street. Their father, who had begged detectives not to give up, sat in silence for hours, refusing to speak. And the town itself seemed to shudder. The disappearance had haunted everyone, but with the discovery came a grim reality. The girls hadn't vanished into thin air. They had been hidden, intentionally, deliberately, close enough that a storm's fury could finally uncover them. The recovery site was treated like sacred ground. Officers stood guard through the night. Detectives took photographs, bagged evidence, and marked every inch of disturbed earth. The storm had washed away more than soil. It had washed away the illusion of safety the town had clung to for over a decade. But even as the remains were identified, new questions surfaced. The sisters had been buried together, but why here? Who had chosen this spot? And how had it gone unnoticed for so long? The discovery gave closure to one part of the mystery, but it also reopened the darkest part of the case. Because now everyone wanted to know, if the sisters had been here all along, who put them there? And could they still be living among them? The discovery changed everything. What had once been a cold case buried in the back of a dusty file room was now the town's most urgent investigation. Detectives reopened every lead, every rumor, every name that had once crossed their desks. Forensic science had advanced since 1990. Tests that hadn't been possible then were now within reach. The fragments of fabric, the soil samples, even the bones themselves, all were sent to modern labs, searching for a clue that had been invisible for over a decade. And soon, patterns began to emerge. One suspect's name came up again and again. A man who had lived only a few streets away from the sisters in 1990. Back then, he'd been questioned, but without evidence, the case against him collapsed. He eventually left town, disappearing into another life. Now, with new forensic techniques, investigators found traces that pulled him back into the spotlight. Soil from his former property matched samples near the burial site. Witnesses, emboldened by time, admitted they had seen him lurking on the night the sisters vanished. The puzzle pieces that hadn't fit before were starting to lock together. But as often happens, just as the case seemed to be tightening, the truth slipped away again. The suspect had died years earlier. Whatever secrets he carried, he had taken to his grave. For the family, this revelation was bittersweet. They finally had a name, a likely culprit, but no trial, no confession, no chance to look the man in the eye and demand answers. The town struggled with the aftermath too. Parents who had raised children under the shadow of fear now realized the danger had been living right beside them all along. For years, they had searched the woods, the fields, the rivers, all while the truth lay quietly buried in the soil of their own community. And yet, the storm had forced a kind of closure. The sisters were brought home at last, laid to rest beside each other, this time in peace. Their story, once whispered as a mystery, became a somber reminder that even in the safest places, darkness can linger unseen. In the end, it wasn't detectives, or neighbors, or time itself that revealed the truth. It was nature, a storm that refused to let the earth keep its secret any longer. The discovery of the bodies should have brought peace, but instead, it ripped open wounds Maple Falls had tried to stitch shut for over a decade. Detectives re-examined old files. Witness statements long thought irrelevant suddenly took on chilling new weight. One man's name kept circling back, An ordinary neighbor, someone people trusted. He had even joined search parties back in 1990, walking through those same woods where the girls were later found. The storm hadn't just unearthed the sisters' remains. It had unearthed the truth about him. And here's where the story twists. Because while whispers spread through the town, no one could yet prove he was the one. The evidence was fragile. The years had blurred memories. Witnesses had grown old or fearful or both. But one clue, buried in the soil with the sisters, was about to speak louder than any living witness ever could. It was small, almost invisible, yet it would change everything. Because in crimes like this, the devil is always in the details. It wasn't the bones that told the story. It was what lay beside them. In the mud, caked in years of decay, investigators found a fragment of cloth, part of the girl's clothing. And on it, something no one expected to survive 11 brutal winters and scorching summers. A trace, invisible to the naked eye, but under the right lens it revealed itself: DNA. Back in 1990, DNA evidence was in its infancy, almost useless for investigators. But by 2001, the science had caught up. What was once invisible now screamed in silence. The fragment was carefully collected, rushed to the lab, and compared against every possible suspect. Days turned into weeks as anticipation built, and then, a hit. The sample matched someone already in the system. Not a stranger, not an outsider, but a man who had lived among them all along. The kind of man who waved hello, who lent tools, who helped hammer nails at a neighbor's barn raising. The kind of man no one ever thought capable of such horror. But now, the evidence was clear. The storm had exposed not only the girl's resting place, it had exposed a killer. When the results came back, the detectives froze. It wasn't just a name on paper, it was a face they all knew. The DNA matched a man who had lived in Maple Falls for decades. A man who had been there the night the girls vanished. Who had stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving families. Who had whispered prayers at the church vigils. The name was Gerald Whitaker. Gerald wasn't a drifter, not a shadowy outsider. He was a husband, a father, and a trusted neighbor. He owned the hardware store downtown, the place everyone in Maple Falls visited at least once a month. He was the man who smiled as he handed over nails, rope, or a flashlight. And now, DNA tied him to the sisters' final moments. The shock rippled through the community like lightning. Mothers pulled their children closer. Neighbors locked their doors. Whispers spread in grocery aisles, in the pews at church, on porches in the fading light. How could it be him? And yet, detectives knew they couldn't move too quickly. Gerald had lived in plain sight for years. If he had done this once, what else was he hiding? And what would he do if he realized the walls were closing in? The storm had revealed the girls' bodies, but now the town braced itself for another storm. One that came with a name, a face, and a terrifying truth. Detectives knew the evidence was strong, but strength wasn't enough. They needed certainty. They needed a case that would not collapse in court, because if Gerald Whitaker walked free, he would never be caught again. So they watched him, quietly, patiently. Day after day, Gerald carried on as if nothing had changed. He opened his shop at 8 a.m. sharp. He waved to customers. He laughed with neighbors. He even sponsored the town's little league team. But beneath the surface, investigators tracked his every move. They sifted through old files, digging into Gerald's past with a fine-tooth comb. And what they found was disturbing. A pattern of complaints. Women who said Gerald had made them uncomfortable. A babysitter who swore she caught him lurking outside her window late at night. A hunting buddy who remembered Gerald taking long, unexplained trips into the woods alone. Individually, they were whispers. Together, they were a storm cloud. Meanwhile, the town lived in fear. Parents kept their kids indoors. Doors that once stayed unlocked were bolted shut. Everyone knew Gerald, but no one knew what he might do if he felt cornered. Finally, after weeks of surveillance, detectives were ready. They moved in quietly, surrounding his house in the early morning fog. The moment was tense. Was Gerald armed? Would he fight? Every second ticked louder than the last. Because this wasn't just an arrest. It was the moment Maple Falls would finally learn if the man who sold them tools and smiled at their children was also the man who had buried two innocent sisters in the dirt. The morning air was heavy with mist when detectives approached Gerald Whitaker's front porch. The paint on the steps was chipped, the wood creaking under their boots. Inside, the faint hum of a coffee maker rattled through the kitchen window. They knocked. Once, twice. The door opened, and there he was, Gerald. Same tired eyes, same polite smile he'd worn for decades. But this time, detectives weren't here for small talk. Gerald Whitaker, one of them said firmly, "You're under arrest for the murders of Sarah and Emily Carter." For a moment, Gerald didn't flinch. He stood frozen, gripping the edge of the doorframe. His mouth twitched, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Then his face hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Detectives moved swiftly, cuffing his wrists. Gerald looked past them, out toward the street where neighbors had already gathered. Curtains twitched, faces peered through glass. Mothers pulled children back from the windows. The man they had trusted, the man who had smiled at every Sunday picnic, was led away in silence. But beneath that silence, the town buzzed with fear and disbelief. If Gerald had hidden this for 11 years, what else was he hiding? And how many more secrets might still be buried beneath Maple Falls? The arrest of Gerald Whitaker should have brought Maple Falls together. Instead, it tore the town in two. On one side were those who believed the evidence was undeniable. They whispered about the DNA, the strange stories from Gerald's past, the way he had always been just a little off. To them, the storm hadn't just uncovered the sisters' bodies. It had exposed the predator who had lived among them all along. But others, they refused to believe it. Gerald had been their neighbor, their friend. He'd fixed their roofs, sharpened their tools, lent a helping hand when barns collapsed in the snow. To accuse him of killing children felt impossible, almost cruel. Some said the police were desperate to close the case and had picked the wrong man. Meanwhile, the Carter family, the parents of the two girls, sat quietly in their home, watching the storm of opinions swirl. For them, the debate didn't matter. They had buried empty coffins in 1990. Now, for the first time in over a decade, they were facing the truth. Their daughters had been found, and the man who took them was finally being held to account. But Maple Falls wasn't ready for what came next. Because as Gerald's trial approached, secrets buried even deeper than the sisters' graves were about to come to light. Testimonies that shocked the courtroom. Stories that painted Gerald in a darker, more sinister light than anyone had dared imagine. The trial wasn't just about justice. It was about forcing Maple Falls to look at itself and admit that evil had worn a familiar face. The courthouse in Maple County was small, just a red brick building with creaking wooden benches and a single brass scale of justice mounted above the doors. But when Gerald Whitaker's trial began, it felt less like a courtroom and more like an arena. Reporters swarmed the steps. Locals lined up before dawn just to get a seat. For many, it wasn't about watching justice. It was about watching a man they had once trusted stripped bare by the truth. Inside, the Carter family sat in the front row. The mother clutched a folded photograph of her daughters, worn at the edges from years of holding it close. The father stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands clasped so hard his knuckles whitened. They had waited 11 years for this moment. Now, every second in that courtroom cut like glass. The prosecution laid out the case with chilling precision. The DNA on the fabric, the inconsistencies in Gerald's alibi, the disturbing whispers from his past stories that, for too long, had been dismissed as harmless oddities. But the defense fought back hard. They claimed the DNA could have been contaminated, that memories after so many years were unreliable. They painted Gerald as a victim of a desperate investigation, a scapegoat to soothe a grieving town. Witness after witness took the stand. Some voices cracked with fear as they recalled Gerald's strange behavior. Others trembled with loyalty, defending him as a kind man, incapable of violence. The jury sat silent, but tension coiled in the air like a storm ready to break. Because when the verdict came, it would not only decide Gerald's fate, it would decide whether Maple Falls had been living in the shadow of a killer all along, or condemning an innocent man to pay for sins he didn't commit. The trial had already stretched for weeks, but it was the testimonies that would etch themselves into memory. First came a former babysitter. Her voice shook as she described nights when Gerald lingered outside her window, his silhouette framed in the glow of the porch light. She had been too afraid to speak back then, too afraid anyone would believe her over kind Mr. Whitaker. But now, with the courtroom watching, her words cut through the silence like glass. Then came a hunting partner, a man who had known Gerald for decades. He recalled trips into the woods where Gerald would vanish for hours without explanation. When pressed, Gerald would only smile and mutter, "Some things are better left unseen." At the time, the man had laughed it off. Now he sat pale and trembling, realizing what those absences might have meant. But the most powerful testimony came not from neighbors or friends. Came from the Carter family. Sarah and Emily's mother stood, clutching that same worn photograph of her daughters. Her voice broke as she spoke of birthdays missed, of Christmas mornings with 2 empty chairs, of walking past their untouched room every day for 11 years. She turned, looked Gerald in the eye, and said, "You buried my children, but you couldn't bury the truth." The courtroom fell silent. Even the defense attorney lowered his gaze. It wasn't evidence in the scientific sense, but it was a blow the jury couldn't ignore. The raw, undeniable human cost of the crime. Now, as the trial reached its end, 12 strangers would retreat into a small room to decide whether Gerald Whitaker was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, or if Maple Falls would once again be left with nothing but shadows. The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving behind an audience that barely dared to breathe. For the Carter family, every tick of the courthouse clock was agony. 11 years of waiting had come down to this. 12 strangers locked in a room, weighing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every haunting silence. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Maple Falls once again, as if nature itself mirrored the tension inside. Reporters lingered on the courthouse steps, townsfolk paced nervously in the hallways, and in the courtroom, Gerald Whitaker sat stone-faced, his hands folded neatly on the defense table. Hours stretched into the evening, then into the night. The jury asked for transcripts. They asked to review the DNA evidence. Each request sent a ripple of dread through the room. The Carter mother whispered to her husband, "What if they don't believe it? What if he walks free?" Her words hung in the air like smoke, unanswered, unbearable. By the second day, the waiting had become torture. Some jurors were seen arguing through the frosted glass of the deliberation room. Others sat with heads bowed, weighed down by the enormity of the decision. And then, on the third day, the message came. A verdict had been reached. The town of Maple Falls held its breath. The Carter family clutched hands. And Gerald Whitaker, for the first time since his arrest, shifted uneasily in his chair. because whatever came next would either lock him away forever or set him free to walk among them once again. The courtroom was packed to the brim when the jury filed back in. Every seat was filled, every aisle crowded with reporters, townsfolk, and families desperate for closure. The air was thick, heavy, so still you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The judge looked over the room, then turned to the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged woman with trembling hands, stood. Her voice cracked, but her words cut through the silence like a blade. "We have, Your Honor." The Carter family held one another, bracing for impact. Gerald Whitaker stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The clerk unfolded the paper, cleared his throat, and read aloud. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the deaths of Sarah and Emily Carter, we find the defendant, Gerald Whitaker." The pause stretched for eternity. Hearts pounded. Breath caught. "Guilty." The word exploded through the courtroom. Sarah and Emily's mother collapsed into her husband's arms, tears streaming down her face. Their father, who had held back for 11 years, finally broke, his shoulders shaking as sobs escaped. Gasps, whispers, even muffled cries rippled through the spectators. Some stared at Gerald in disbelief, others in quiet satisfaction. Gerald himself did not move. His face was pale, lips pressed tight, as deputies stepped forward to take him into custody. Justice, long delayed, had finally spoken. But as the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, one truth lingered. Maple Falls would never forget that the man who once fixed their fences and sold them nails had, for over a decade, hidden the darkest of secrets. The verdict was only the beginning. Days later, the courthouse filled again, this time for Gerald Whitaker's sentencing. The weight of the moment was different. The suspense was gone, replaced with a solemn finality. But the emotions ran just as deep. The prosecution argued for the maximum penalty, painting Gerald as a predator who had hidden behind the mask of a good neighbor. The defense tried one last time, asking the court for mercy, insisting Gerald was not beyond redemption. Then came the moment everyone had waited for, the Carter family's chance to speak. Sarah and Emily's father stood first. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he gripped the podium. "For 11 years, he said, we didn't know where our little girls were. We buried empty caskets and prayed for answers. You took their lives, Gerald, but you didn't take their spirit. Today, justice has found you." Their mother followed, clutching the photograph of her daughters. Through tears, she said, "I will never forgive what you've done, but I will no longer live in fear of you. My daughters can finally rest." The judge looked over the courtroom, his expression stern, his words echoing against the paneled walls. "Gerald Whitaker, you committed a crime so cruel it scarred this town for more than a decade. The evidence is clear, the jury has spoken. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A hush swept through the room. Some sighed with relief, others with sorrow. Gerald was led away in chains, no longer the smiling shopkeeper of Maple Falls, but a convicted murderer whose name would forever be tied to the sisters he had silenced. And as the doors closed behind him, the Carter family finally walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, free of the weight that had haunted them for 11 long years. The trial was over. Gerald Whitaker was gone, locked behind walls that would hold him for the rest of his life. But in Maple Falls, the shadows he cast lingered long after the courthouse doors closed. For some, the verdict brought peace. Parents who had once feared letting their children walk to school alone finally exhaled. The Carter family, though forever changed, could at last visit their daughters' graves knowing the truth had been spoken aloud. The empty coffins buried in 1990 were no longer symbols of despair but markers of resilience. Yet for others, the wound remained raw. Some neighbors struggled to reconcile the man they'd shared meals with, bought nails from, and trusted with their children, with the monster the court revealed. It was easier to believe the storm had unearthed something new than to admit the darkness had been living among them all along. The town itself seemed different. Doors stayed locked now. Strangers were no longer waved at with the same warmth. Maple Falls had lost something it would never get back: its innocence. Still, every September, when the air grew crisp and the leaves turned, the community gathered at the Carter graves. Candles flickered, songs were sung, and in the quiet, people whispered Sarah and Emily's names, not as victims, but as reminders. Reminders that evil can wear the most ordinary face, that silence does not mean safety, and that sometimes, even after 11 years, the truth will claw its way back to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. In the end, the storm that tore through Maple Falls did more than uproot trees and flood streets. It uncovered a truth that had been buried for over a decade. Sarah and Emily Carter had vanished on an ordinary walk home, and for 11 years their families lived in silence, haunted by questions with no answers. But nature itself refused to keep their secret. A storm shifted the earth, and what was hidden could no longer remain so. Gerald Whitaker thought time would protect him. He believed he could bury his sins as deeply as the sisters he left beneath the soil. But time has a way of turning, and the storm became his undoing. Justice came late, far later than it should have, but it came. And while Maple Falls may never heal completely, the truth gave the Carter family something they had been denied for so long: a chance to finally mourn and to finally begin again. Evil may wear the face of a neighbor, a friend, even the man who sells you nails with a smile. But the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of clawing back to the surface. And sometimes all it takes is a storm. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to your channel name, where we uncover the darkest mysteries, the forgotten crimes, and the truths that time itself tries to bury.